Welcome to A Scrap Life, a podcast solely focused on the hustlers, grinders, operators, and business owners who live and breathe the scrap metal industry every day. We are the original recyclers. No suits required, just guts and hard work. Here is your host, Brett Eckhart.
All right, guys, I am back with another episode of A Scrap Life. And the coolest thing about my job is I get to, at least about this specific job, is that I get to interview people from all over the scrap world. And I got an interesting guest today, someone that I've been following now for, I think, a couple of years, paying attention to what he has to say, because I know he knows his space like nobody I've really ever heard. His name's Matt Watson. He's with Precious Metals Commodities Management, LLC. And while some people may not really think of precious metals when they think about recycling, especially some of the up and coming metals that Matt's going to kind of break down for us, I think it's super imperative to understand the green revolution, what's going on. And I got the expert here, so I'm looking forward to having the conversation. Matt, thanks for carving out the time, man.
Oh, Brett, thanks for having me. And again, nice to meet you. Yeah,
we finally got to meet. We're kind of emailing, text back and forth, and I'm glad we at least got to meet via Zoom. Someday I'll meet you in person.
Yep.
So, Matt, I was just kind of cruising through your history. Actually, I want to take a step back. So I got introduced to you. Somebody sent me a video on a speech you gave about silver. And it was like 2 or 3 years ago. I'm thinking about 3-ish, 2.5 years ago. And you went into how important silver is going to be in the up and coming, solar market and the industrial green revolution that's coming. And at that time, I want to say silver was it like 19, 20 bucks or something like that. And I'm not a big stock. I'm going to put it out there. I'm not a big stock trader. It's not something I do. All my money's pretty much invested in scrap, recycling, whether trucks, storage facilities, just running our business and dumping as much money as I can back into it to grow. And somebody sent me this. It was like an hour video, and I was watching it, and you went and you kind of outlined, I think, like 4 silver mining companies, and you discussed in that video, when you're looking for a mining company because you're interested in buying silver, look for mining companies that are primarily mining silver. So like there's a lot of companies out there that kind of they mine silver, or they get silver because they're in the process of mining other materials.
Right.
And that was kind of my introduction. And I went all in. I'm not going to lie. I took whatever money I had in the stock market and I bought, and this is kind of how I go. I'm like all or none, right? And I'm not saying that's the best way. I'm just saying it's my way.
So you bought in about a year ago at about 15 or so.
Yeah, exactly.
And now it's sitting at 23.
Yeah. So long story short, that made me a believer. Listening to that talk, I was like, this guy knows his shit. So I'm just going to pay attention to what he does. So I'm excited to get you in front of guys and gals that listen to this podcast, and just kind of, if they don't know you, at least introduce you. So
not a problem. You mind if I go on a bit of a rant here with silver and copper? One of your favorites is copper too, right?
I would absolutely love for you to just kind of do what you do.
Okay. So when you look at the periodical table, the 2 most conductive metals on the periodical table are, number 1, silver, followed very closely by copper. Very different in nature. Silver has 105% of the conductivity of silver if you use copper's conductivity as a baseline. Silver is used on the solar panels, used in electronics extensively. It's even used as a catalyst in certain chemical industries, ethylene oxides. It's also an investment product and used quite extensively in jewelry, as you know. So there's a broad use of silver, but the one standout piece when you look at the supply and demand fundamentals on silver is the solar field, solar PV. So here we are last year in 2020, I think we did about 115 gigawatts of new installations of solar PV globally, and it consumed a little under 100 million troy ounces of silver in that process. So 10% of the global silver supply went to solar PV in 2020. The issue is, in terms of the ramp on solar PV, you ain't seen nothing yet. there are very serious discussions by governments about growing the year over year new installations to as much as about 50x today's present level of build out with solar. There's IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, which has laid out a roadmap. They want to see about 14 terawatts of solar PV installed and operational by 2050. You see agencies like IRENA that are calling for this, and when you plot out the trajectory, that means we're going to be using over 50% of the global supply of silver. With design thrifting that occurs year over year, they were able to reduce it some 5-6% year over year in reduction of weight per watt. But even with the best design thrifting efforts, you're still going to be consuming half of the global silver supply into solar PV by 2050. And that's just astonishing. I mean, what's going to happen to all these other applications, including jewelry, investment? And my premise is that silver is going to become very much dominated as a industrial metal. There's not going to be a lot of excess slack for investment products, for bullion, for coins. I think in our lifetime, by the mid 2040s, it's going to be dominated by industrial demand. When you dig into the picture of how much silver is in the ground, you refer to the USGS, the U.S. Geological Service. You look at, they publish for each of the metals pictures of what they know, what are known reserves, global reserves. And a known reserve is, we know where it's at a depth and in a region that's accessible and at today's prices is economic to extract. So there's only about 16 years worth of additional supply in known reserves. And then beyond that, you get into a bucket that's called inferred resources, lower grade bodies that aren't economical to recover today, but let's say the price doubles or triples, then perhaps it becomes viable to extract those and go get those as well. There, you're limited though. I think you're sitting on, in total in the Earth's crust, in terms of mineable anything, you're sitting at maybe another incremental 40 years worth of supply. So I think there's somewhere in the neighborhood of under 60 years worth of total supply of silver. It is really a finite amount of metal. And one of the unfortunate things, now let's turn it to recycling, is so much of the silver that's in products today goes unrecovered. You get into issues where it's characterized as a low-grade silver in a lot of electronics and e-waste, for example. Mm-hmm. And it's there, but it's there at 0.5% or 1%. And you'll spend more money on treatment charges doing the refining and extraction and smelting and getting it out than the metal that you recover at the end of the day. And so as a result, a lot of the silver goes unprocessed, unrecycled, and we're throwing way too much of it into our landfills. And this ties right into this discussion of solar panels. Are we going to recover and recycle and scrap our solar panels properly, or are we just going to throw them in landfills? This is a discussion that's, is really not dominated the news, but suddenly we're at a point now, these solar panels last about 25 years in life. Well, now we're at the point where a lot of these lead installations are 25 years old. They're going to start going to landfills here en masse. And with it is a buttload of silver on top of those modules.
So on that deal, I mean, and I don't, just to interrupt you real quick. So when you say the average PV, solar panel, that they're lasting 25 years, it feels like, just like anything that's electronic or technology driven, the first iteration lasts longer than the second, third, fourth, fifth iteration. So if right now the average solar panel lasts 25 years, I mean, I would have to think, or I'd have to anticipate that the second wave, third wave, fourth wave is like a 15-year, or and so
I'm not sure that,
or is that not necessarily true with those panels?
If anything, actually, the performance, the electrical performance, if you will, of the solar panels has exceeded expectations. Actually, there's some that are going to survive 30 years, which is great, as opposed to windmills, these gigantic windmills and these wind turbines, which are breaking down at 20 years or younger. Yeah. And those too go to landfill. Those are enormous wind blades are going to stack up in our landfills and are going to be really problematic unless we can come up with a recycle process for those. But in the case of the solar panels, really it's going to take a doubling of the price. We got to get the silver closer to about $50 a troy ounce to make the economics such that it's going to warrant retrieval from solar panels. And I think we're going to get there. I don't think it's going to happen overnight or in the next 2 or 3 years, but I think my projection for the silver price is if you look historically at the past 30 years, it's grown on about an 8.3% year-over-year growth in price on average. There's noise up and down around that, but on average, it's growing at about an 8.3% CAGR, compound annual growth rate. I would expect that to continue.
And that's what I like about your research is you, like us, a lot of scrap guys, we look at it for like a month or what's going to happen this week, because we're trading materials coming through. But what I really took away from that speech you gave, a couple of years ago is, and I'm a buy and hold guy. I'm not smart enough to trade every day. It's just not my style. But reason I want everybody to listen to what you have to say is, you're not saying the price is going to double in silver tomorrow or next year, but you're saying, like, look at the numbers, and you're projecting it out, and you're looking at available material, what's coming down the line. So for the people out there that are my age, younger, that have money to invest, or they're looking for good opportunities for a buy and hold type of a scenario, then they need to take a strong, hard look at these metals. So I'd go back, not to interrupt you, but I like your approach to it.
But and by the way, silver's just one example. I think you could throw copper into this discussion. I think you could throw a lot of the platinum group metals, platinum, ruthenium, and iridium are going to perform very well. I think you're going to see zinc continue to perform well. There's a whole list of metals. As we electrify our worlds, and as we try to transition all of our transportation to electric vehicles, the utilization of these critical metals increases profoundly. Solar panels, wind farms, the loadings of critical metals are actually 3 times higher than the conventional grid. And so we're pushing ourselves to a state where the demand on fundamental metals is going to accelerate much more rapidly than it has in the past. So silver's just one. So I have a very bullish outlook on silver. You're right. It's not going to spike, but it's just going to be kind of a steady climb over the next couple of decades. So certainly a good case for investment. You're right. There are mining groups that you could pay attention to that are a good way to invest. Another simple way to invest is an electronic traded fund. There's at least 6 or 7 good silver ETFs I could point you to that are grouped around the metals prices or miners or junior miners. There's different ways to invest very easily, get in and out of stocks without physically taking possession of silver. You could buy a stake into the silver market. And then the other metal that we started off talking about was copper. Copper is used extensively for power transmission. 75% of copper goes into wiring. Wiring that's used in our homes, our businesses, buildings, infrastructure, in our vehicles. In a gasoline engine, it uses about a third of the copper that we put into these BEVs, like a Tesla. The loadings of copper in full range EVs is 3 times higher than a conventional car. Windmills use a lot of copper to transport the power that they've collected to get it connected to the grid. Windmills, same thing, especially offshore wind, uses a very high rate of copper. Whenever you're burying a power cable underground or underwater to connect power to the grid, inevitably you're going to use a solid copper cable. And so there's a lot of demand that's coming our way with this onslaught of renewables that's coming our way. And so, so copper is touching we're scotch under $10,000 a ton today. But I think it's going to continue to be pressured. It's another one of these. It's not going to spike overnight, but it's just going to be continually under pressure. The mining, when you plot out the mining supply versus demand, the mining's not going to be able to keep up. We're going to have to exploit deposits all over the place, especially places like Chile. But we're really going to need to step up the rate of mining on copper.
Some of the stuff I've found interesting, what you've said regarding the mining and the NIMBY, not my backyard. I've listened to some of your PowerPoint presentations, and I found interesting, and something I'd like to hear you touch on too is as a recycling company, and we get pretty heavily regulated in what we do and how we go about our business, but mining companies are even more underneath the microscope, especially if you're trying to install or add on to an existing mine or
Yep.
start up a new mine. And I think
Right.
that's an important point that you've really made and made me really think is okay, so there's going to be these pressures on these crucial industrial metals, whether it's copper or silver or some of these other ones we can go into, but the ability or the willingness for some people to get behind somebody installing a new mine, if you truly think that the green revolution is needs to be part of the answer to lowering these carbon emissions, then you probably need to figure out how to get behind either expanding existing mines or allowing new ones to exist.
I mean, think of it simplistically. If you want to get away from burning fossil fuels and you want to electrify everything as an alternative energy source where you could charge batteries in cars and so forth, you're going to have to grow the amount of electronics profoundly. You're going to have to grow the grid by a factor of 3 between now and the end of 2050. And yeah, there'll be a lot of copper that goes into transformers and into a lot of the power transmission lines. All the overhead lines, a lot of aluminum. So aluminum is another metal that'll be taxed significantly. And you're right. There's the pressure on miners. It's funny. I think the environmentalists don't realize what they're asking for. So they know they want all these clean energy sources and they want to electrify everything. But once you say that, what you're really saying is, I want to go double the rate of mining. And they don't connect the two. I'm an environmentalist, and I love to say, "Oh, so you're into mining?" And their initial was, "Oh no, I don't like mining at all." And so they're at conflict with themselves. And so how it bears itself out in the mining industry is the timelines. If you showed up with $100 million to develop a copper mine somewhere, the environmental hurdles that you have to jump through to get all your permitting done, to start production and begin extraction, is growing. And so even an open pit, a fairly shallow deposit that usually takes 5 years from funding to operations, now is suddenly 7 or 10 years with all these additional hurdles that people have to go through.
And expensive costs too, right?
Yeah, and it's all environmental and social governance, making sure the way you're going to manage your mine tailings is appropriate, that you're not polluting the groundwaters, air pollution. There's a lot of interest in mining. How much CO2 are you putting into the air in smelting and processing the ore that you're extracting? Well, it ends up you're putting quite a bit of emissions into the air. And so there's a lot of pressure on miners to green up, if you will, their smelting and their power sources for mining. Now to your point about recycle, one of the key points recyclers like yourselves needs to advocate is, when you're doing recycle, you're going to resmelt that metal, but it's in a much higher percentage grade material. It takes a lot less energy to process it in a recycle state than it does when you take it out of the ground. I mean, to the range of like 10 to 1 or more in some cases. And so your CO2 footprint on recovering copper is so much cleaner than going and getting new stuff out of the ground. And so, yes, we need to put a premium on the recycled materials. And in fact, I think there's a discussion about will there be price premiums even for recycled material over virgin material out of the ground? There should be. It's a greener material in that respect. And so that's one of the way governments are looking at how do we encourage recycling.
Does that circle back to where you're talking about with the silver and the low grade, where you're saying like recycling the electronics, like, okay, like maybe that silver that's being recycled at 1%, 2%. It has to have a premium.
You can't keep throwing it in landfills is the bottom line. Yeah. We're going to need to recover all that silver, even to the point that I advocate even government regulations to help force the recycle, to put a CRV, like a bottle deposit, if you will, on every module sold. Put the price of the recycle into the price of the solar panel to begin with, such that the money's there at the end when it's time to be recycled, that you recycle it no matter what the prices of the metals are. I think you have to do more of that sort of forced recycle. This is going to be a problem in the EV battery space, as you know, if you deal with automotive scrapyards. What are we going to do with all these batteries? That's a real problem. So forcing recycle on some of the cheaper varieties of these batteries is another area. Solar panels. Solar panels are caustic. There's 10% of the solar panels have cadmium, and there's lots of leads in these products. You don't want that going to our landfills, and yet that's where it's going to go today unless we alter our path. And so I see the need for governments to really expand the rate of what we're capturing into recycle streams. E-waste, you're a student of e-waste, electronic waste. I mean, we're lucky to be capturing about 14% on a global level. Too much of it is getting by. Most of the e-waste shops are really proficient at segregating the higher content, the higher value stuff, printed circuit boards, and some of the higher content. They know where the gold's at. They know where some of the platinum higher price metals are at, and they'll go get it. But unfortunately, some of the lower grade materials, not that you couldn't recycle it, you can. The technology exists, but you don't. If you spend more money on recycle than what you get out of the end of the pipe. Therefore, that's so much of this goes to landfills, get shipped off to Africa or Southeast Asia, and it's just there's cities that are just accumulating with piles and piles of electronic waste. It's
So
something the world's going to have to deal with more efficiently. What we're doing
in 2010, 2009, I decided we need to really start paying attention to the e-scrap market. That's something that's up and coming. There's all this material. There was actually some good homes for the material price wise. And so I really, we started United Electronics Recycling, and we got really behind it. The problem that we faced, which is exactly what you're talking about, but the big problem we faced is in the state of Idaho, there was no requirements for recycling e-scrap. So we basically kind of were like, competing against ourselves in the fact that the commodity values were starting to come down, as e-scrap became more prominent, it became more of it out there. And then as China, as the Olympics came, they really cracked down. And so then the value of the material started coming down. And then by the state of Idaho or the surrounding states, Washington, California, Oregon, they had like mandates, forced recycling of e-scrap. And they were basically kicking back these companies, I don't know, a certain dollar amount per pound for receiving the material and processing it. But in Idaho, that wasn't an option. So the materials just go in these landfills. You can't really pay for it to a certain extent. There's some material you can pay for, but it's generally speaking, it's like you said, it's more costly to recycle than the value you're getting out of it. And so that material was going to landfill, and we just kind of felt like we were fighting a losing battle. So we really backed really hard out of it, and that's when we transitioned into the converter space with platinum, palladium, rhodium. But ultimately, our story with e-scrap is exactly what you're saying. Yeah. And Idaho is not the only state that doesn't require, it's not forcing people to recycle these items in a proper fashion, or at least getting some government subsidy to recycle them correctly. And so we just kind of threw our hands up there and said, hey, we've got a certain set of customers that know that we do the right thing with the material. We're going to keep them. We're going to service them, take care of them. But we are not going to extend our business any farther trying to force something that's unenforceable,
Right. No, and again, I'm not big on, regulations for the sake of regulations, but we just simply can't keep throwing things in the landfill. There's finite amounts of these metals that are at ore grades that are high enough that it's worthy of doing the mining. And even then, the rate of mining is going to have to grow at a pace that nobody wants to hear about. On copper, I love throwing out this statistic. So in the past 1,000 years, we've mined about 560 million tons of copper in the past 1,000 years. So there's basically a large part of the span of humanity's use of copper. Great. In the next 30, we're going to need to double that.
Yeah.
In the next 30 years, we need to double that. And
that's
by
crazy.
the way,
that's like mind-boggling to think about, right? Like it's just that math. And I pride myself on just basic math. That's it. And that's basic math, and it's kind of like mind-boggling.
and you think about the mine tailings that copper has generated more than any other metal on the periodical table. Roughly half of the world's mine tailings are from copper mining. And you could stack up the mine tailings over the island of Manhattan and cover it a little short of a kilometer deep over the entire island in mine tailings just from copper. And we want to go double that in the next 30 years. Oh my goodness.
Can you describe mine tailings? I mean, I'm not super familiar with the mining industry, but
So
the mine tailings, can you just for my own knowledge
you,
and for anybody else listening that doesn't really understand that piece of
you,
it?
you dig, you extract, you process the ore that's got the stuff you're looking for. Everything else gets dumped in a pile. It's mine tailings. It's everything else. It's everything else that you're not trying to extract. It's just the pile of dirt and earth. The big concern is what chemistries and chemicals have been used in processing some of that earth. Unfortunately, for example, like on nickel, there's a lot of acids that are used in processing to get the nickel separated from the rest of the ore body and the rock. And so they do what's called a high pressure acid bleach process, and they'll get the nickel to dissolve away, and they can extract and separate the nickel out for further refinement and processing. Unfortunately, the mine tailings are contaminated with a great deal of acids now. And
Does that
so we
ever
have,
go away, Matt? Is that something that, I mean, it's hard to know, but I mean, is that something that eventually, that dilutes out over time or?
yeah, and what does it dilute to into your groundwater? And yeah,
Okay.
it's a real problem. In Indonesia, there's a body of ore that the nickel comes from. It's a nickel pig iron in a laterite ore. They're using a lot of these acids, and it creates a really fluffy mine tailing where you get the residuals are like sub 5 microns. It's very easy to puff it up. And this is in a region with just immense rainfall and volcanic activity and seismic activity, earthquakes, and so maintaining dams and maintaining the huge amounts of these mine tailings is a problem in itself. And so one of the things the Chinese owned mines are doing is they're taking their mine tailings, they're running it out through a pipeline and dumping it into the ocean
Wow.
at a deep depth of over 1,000 meters in most cases. The problem I have with that is where they're dumping it in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and New Caledonia. That's where over half the world's coral reefs reside, in a region they call the Coral Triangle. And so we're dumping millions of tons of mine tailings into the oceans in regions where we have all of our coral reefs. Oh boy, that sounds like a great plan.
Yeah.
But frankly, that's the cheapest way to manage it. Out of sight, out of mind.
100%. Just kind of
And,
like trash was like,
yeah,
or I mean, I'm sure it's still going on in some areas where they're just dumping
yeah.
boatloads of trash in the ocean because it's out of sight, out of mind.
So it ends up the metal set that goes into a lot of these batteries, specifically lithium, nickel, and cobalt. Um, those are three that cause a lot of ecological damage and concerns. Um, Cobalt, comes from a region. There's one country in the Central Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's just a human rights mess. 90% of the population lives in extreme poverty on less than $700 a year. And, they're sitting in all these metals and minerals that are really their best hope of getting out of that conundrum. But unfortunately, the government is so corrupt, and even about a third of the landmass of that country isn't even controlled by the government. It's been controlled by armed militias for 20 plus years. There's over 6 million dead in the past 20 plus years from regional strife and civil war and infighting, including 70% of the Rwandan Tutsis. That's called genocide. And so, you have child labor violations and just on and on. And these people are just impoverished. And all of this wonderful mining for these battery metals that are going to save the planet with EVs, their lives haven't improved one iota. It's still a mess. And it's just horrific what, again, a lot of Chinese companies have gone in, bought out the cobalt mines. I'm sorry, they just don't have the environmental and social conscious that the most of the Western world has. They just don't care the same way.
They're
And
more driven by the dollar, like
yeah,
the currency, the value of
make
the material versus,
make it
the
cheap.
actual carbon,
Yeah, they want to make
emission
it cheap.
reduction.
Make it cheap. And then to make matters worse, then they boat up a lot of the ore. They get the ore that they want of nickel or cobalt, and they'll bulk ship it over to China, and they'll process and smelt and process all that and refine it on a coal-based power grid in China, which China's power grid is largely coal-based. Yes.
Yeah.
By the way, they're going to add, some 300 more coal fire plants in China.
I saw that, and I was just reading that the other day, and they just went to that COP 26, whatever, and they went through, and everybody, we're going to reduce emission, do this, that, and all of a sudden, like a few days later, they come out and said, not only has their coal consumption not went down, but it actually went up.
Oh, they're going up.
Going to add, an exponential amount of coal-fired power plants, and it's kind of like I've always said, don't listen to what people say, watch what they do. And if you just do that in life,
yep,
I think you're going to be much farther ahead, and whether it's investing or just watching people in society in general, like drown out what they're saying and just look at their actions. Their actions will tell you the real story.
Agreed. And so, I argue a lot of these BEVs that they're making in China with their coal-based grid and then recharging the vehicles with a coal-based grid are actually dirtier than gasoline engines in vehicles over their lifetimes. People don't want to hear that. The other big concern with BEVs is what's going to be the expected lifetime. This is very much a recycle question. ICE vehicles, gasoline diesel vehicles, they last on average a little over 19 years of life before they hit the scrapyards, with nearly 240,000 miles on average in that range. BEVs, I think they're planning in many of these to have a lifetime with the battery of about 10 years. Are we going to effectively double the cadence on recycle of electric vehicles? You can replace your batteries. By the way, replacing a Tesla battery in the entire length of the floorboard of the car. I saw a guy that had damaged his battery. He had to pay $16,500 to replace the battery. I think that's going to trigger a lot of scrap decisions.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, if insurance companies right now to this day, even on ICE vehicles, they're totaling cars just by the pure cost of what it's taking to repair. From parts standpoint, whatever. And they're perfectly good vehicles, generally speaking, but they're totaling a lot of cars that they never would have totaled a couple of years ago. I really don't believe that are being told today. So. And that's something that I even never thought about. And I'm in the freaking recycle business, right? I've never even taken that into consideration, that's probably something that needs to be at least discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, really for the automotive scrap genre, we've got to, you got to have some intelligence about these lithium ion batteries that are going into vehicles. A lot of the early hybrids and plug-in hybrids have smaller batteries. They may only be a couple 300 pounds weight total. But a lot of those are lithium iron phosphate, where when you look at the metals that go in, what has value? Well, the lithium has the most value at, it's somewhere around over $13,000 a ton these days. But the rest of the metals, the iron and the phosphate, are extremely cheap. And again, it's one of those equations with LFP type of batteries. The technology's there you can do recycle and get everything out, but it costs you more to recycle than what you get out, so they don't get recycled. And so those are kind of the unwanted battery varieties, is these LFPs. The type that everybody wants as a recycler are more of these nickel and cobalt rich. Cobalt, I think it's crossed through $55,000 a ton. It's the most expensive. Nickel, $20,000 a ton ballpark. And lithium as well. It does pay to recycle. The ecosystem will take care of itself. There's value in them. They're hills, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is the ratio. How many of these batteries are the low end variety, and how many are the higher end nickel rich composition varieties? And it's not easy to tell. They're not labeled. So as you're sitting there as a scrap collector, what's what? How do you segregate? It's nearly impossible to segregate. You don't know what you have, and so some of the lead recycling efforts in the US, as you know, they're willing to take all the batteries off your hands if you deliver it to their dock. It's up on you, the scrapyard, to deliver, which poses its own constraints and problems, including cross-state line transport. Some of these materials are treated as hazardous materials in some states. It's really a hodgepodge of regulations on transport and cost on transport. But if you could get it to somebody's doorstep that he'll take the whole lock, stock, and barrel of it, the cheap stuff and the more expensive stuff, but he's not going to pay you for it. Thanks for dropping it off. Bye.
Yep.
Nothing for you in this ecosystem. By the way, that's a ripoff. There's enough money value in those. They should be paying the scrap people, but they don't.
And then where do those go?
And so they will process the whole lock, stock, and barrel. They'll get as much lithium, nickel, and cobalt as what they're after out of that entire population of batteries, and they'll refine it, and they'll be able to use it in the next cycle. And again, just like most metals, the CO2 footprint of recycling, you have less CO2 emissions the second time around in recycle than you do taking it out of the ground for the same metals. But there's a whole lot of legislation that's got to evolve and develop in this space about batteries. As you know, there's scrap yards that are building dog piles of this stuff, and it's a hazardous material. You just can't leave it there.
Yeah.
There's the potential for these piles to catch on fire. And heaven forbid and there have been scrapyard fires, as you know.
You're seeing a lot of shredder, facility fires, because this is a big problem with shredder yards. They're stacking up appliances, and everything now has a lithium ion battery, and they're running. I mean, you're seeing some crazy large fires, and it's all battery driven, you know?
Yeah. And so the environmentalists and the regulators are pushing us in this direction. And yet there's a whole lot of holes on the scrap end of this. How do we manage it appropriately? Handling, how do we deal with this thing correctly? I think Europeans are far ahead of us in that regard. What they're doing in Europe is they're putting the onus on the recycle of these car batteries on the automakers themselves. So VW, Tesla, and the likes, they have to pay the tab for recycle. Which is good. So that takes the pressure off these low cost variety of batteries. Who's going to pay for it? At least it's paid for.
Mm-hmm.
That's the good news. The bad news is on these LFPs, these cheap batteries, they're treating it a lot like they do e-waste. They're segregating it. They're building up piles of the cheap stuff. They're putting it on bulk shippers and shipping it off to Africa and Southeast Asia, just like e-waste.
Yeah.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
Well, the problem's still there. I can show you pictures coming out of China on the battery accumulation going on there. It's a wave of scrap. I mean, our rate of packing out landfills is going to triple, people, with what we're doing. We can't keep just doing this. We've got to recycle everything much more proficiently than what we do today. And so in general, my message to the recyclers like yourself is, hey, the prices of the metals are going to do nothing but continue to climb. So in that regard, there's a business proposition for you.
Mm-hmm.
But there's going to be more materials like these batteries that are, hazardous in a lot of ways. And it's going to take a lot more training and diligence and even regulations to get this thing wrapped up completely as an ecosystem that these recycle systems can stand on their own and just operate seamlessly. The U.S. has a long way to go, as does Asia, China, Japan.
Why do you think, out of curiosity, because I feel like there's a lot of instances where Europe is ahead of us on the recycle front, and especially like some of even our copper processing chopping lines. Those originated out of Europe. I mean, the technology originated out of there. And I mean, why do you think that? I mean, I have my ideas, but in your opinion, why are they so much farther ahead of us on some of these fronts?
I just think the human density, they're more tightly packed. I think their aversion to landfills is just higher than ours. I think we just have too much real estate. We got Utah. We've got places where you could build huge landfills, out of sight, out of mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I just think them being in closer proximity to their land, I think puts a little bit more of a premium on this. You need to have a full cycle view to this, and then even the metals demand of what you're asking for. Again, back to the environmentalists, they want to electrify everything, but they don't want to mine. So those ideas are just completely in conflict with one another.
Can I ask you a question? I was kind of going to revert back to the ocean side. So I've been reading, the last probably 6 months. There was a company that was working on basically the green light to start mining the ocean floor, right?
Yeah,
you probably know this space, I would assume, fairly well, just because you understand the mining side. Can you speak on that and is that a game changer for some of these more rare metals, or is it just another green washing type scheme?
No, it's legit. I mean, So one of the concerns, even with things like lithium, it's abundant in all the salt flats. So anything like the Bonneville salt flats close to you, in Southern California, there's this area called the Salton Sea. Outside of Mexico City, there's some big salt flats. A lot of the lithiums are there. You can go extract, but there's metals like nickel, and manganese, and even some of the rare earth elements that you hear about, the REs, that are in compositions that are thought to be fairly retrievable in nodules or rock type formations lying on the seabed floor.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like they want to necessarily go in and dig into the seafloor bed. They really want to scavenge some of the rock formations on the seabed that are rich in nickel and manganese and so forth. There's regions between California and Hawaii that are supposed to be rich in these sorts of nodules. There's some islands in the Japanese island chain that are very rich in rare earths. Now, there, unfortunately, would be more of a digging into the seabed floor to extract those rare earths. But these metals have become so profound in our everyday electronics and technologies and green energy technologies that we can't, you're going to need them at some point. You can't just keep mining these known reserves. They're going to exhaust themselves.
Yeah.
And where else do we go? Chile, the shoestring country on the South American coast, holds a lot of key deposits. Well, unfortunately, there's peoples and cities on top of those regions. What are we going to do? And we're really going to have to exploit Chile in a huge way to get the copper, and a few others. So
Arizona, I've been reading some Arizona, New Mexico. There's some big copper deposits, but you're starting to get it. That I was reading an article here the other day about that, kind of going back to that, not in my backyard.
Yeah.
People are worried about their water source. They're worried about, they understand that originally they moved next to a copper mine, so they're okay with the existence, but there's a big mine there down in New Mexico that's trying to expand, and they're like, well, if you expand now, what happens to our water source? What happens to more explosions,
Sure.
as they blast the material out so they can recover the copper, and that goes back to the original conversation of they want, there's a lot of wants, but the requirements to get those wants are they're out there.
Yeah. So it's funny, on these lithium from these the salt flats, or what they call a brine composition, you need huge amounts of fresh water to harvest the lithium. You need about 500,000 gallons of fresh water for every 1 ton of lithium extracted in most of these regions. Well, hold it. They're a salt flat for a reason. There's no water.
Exactly.
What are we going to do? And so in the 12,000 foot plus elevation in the Andes, with Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina, is over 56% of the global lithium reserves in salt flats at 12,000 plus foot altitude. Well, the lithium mining that's going on there today it's minuscule compared to where it needs to go to scale and ramp this EV transition like they want to transition. And yet there's already water wars going on at that altitude. And what are you going to do for fresh water to do more of this extraction? There was even a serious discussion, well, can we do desalination and pump it up 12,000 foot elevation just to give them fresh water to do what they need to do? And people are at war with the indigenous people over water rights. You're absolutely right. So lithium can be very water intensive in the salt flats on these brines. And you're right. The acid controls, groundwater pollution, all this is absolutely a concern. And depending on the population density of the region. Now, Arizona, New Mexico, that's fairly low population density, right? If we can't get it going there, then my goodness, you're never going to stand a chance in more populous regions, right?
No, and that's the rub. That's the rub I see is, in a perfect world, where do you see this? If you could design it your way, would you, make the transition slower so that you could, kind of walk before you run type deal, or is how do you see it? How would you play it out if given the opportunity?
And this is a really open-ended question, but
And sir,
First
I
of
mean,
all,
yeah, for what you
first of
feel
all,
comfortable with,
no. So first of all, renewables. I think there's a lot of marketing that's gone into the clean energy space that sell us on these ideas that just aren't true. And renewables are not going to save the planet, as an unfortunate thing. And don't get me wrong, I am as environmentally conscious as the next guy. I want clean air and clean water and clean oceans. Um, but I think there's better ways to get there than the wind and solar path. Not that they don't have their place, they do, but not at the scale that they're trying to take us to. I think that's going to just consume way too much metals to get us where do we need to go. I think nuclear is a much better power source with a much smaller footprint, higher energy density per real estate, if you will. And it's interesting, there's a lot of clean energy advocates that were on the cutting edge the past couple of decades that have transitioned and have come to that same conclusion, that renewables are not going to save the planet, that we need to push nuclear much more aggressively. Unfortunately, the same cadre of clean energy advocates in California, where I'm from, and Germany, are pulling the plug on nuclear early. The nuclear is the most reliable energy source. It operates 97% of the year consistently, and you can variably throttle it quickly. So if renewables kick in, you can back off on the nuclear and let renewables do their thing. Unfortunately, though, with the renewables, they're variable in nature. The wind's not always on, the sun's not always up. And our peak evening demands from 5 p.m. to 10, 11 p.m. at night are where you need to surge. What are we going to do for this? And so we're driving ourselves down a variable renewable path without enough stability in the rest of the grid. And that's going to pose a lot of problems, both on the cost front, as well as the reliability of energy front, without massive terawatt scale energy storage solutions. And this is where I think the hydrogen economy discussion kicks in, using hydrogen as a means to store energy to help you balance the load, both seasonally and within time of day, to meet your peak demands. So if I were king for a day, I'd be backing off on the renewables, pushing more investment into nuclear facilities, and that would be one play. Next would be the vehicle transition. I think these EV transition is not going to go anywhere like people think. I think these mining constraints are already showing themselves, even at the 4.5–5% penetration on BEVs globally that we're at today. You hear a lot about zero emission mandates, where governments want to force you're going to either drive a Tesla, a full range 300-mile plus BEV, or you're going to have a fuel cell electric vehicle. And it's just not going to happen to the dates they set. They have a lot that have transition dates in 2030, 35, 40, where there's percentages of our vehicle fleets that are supposed to transition to zero emissions. Well, the multiples needed in lithium and nickel and cobalt just aren't going to happen quick enough in the mining space. We're going to be constrained. We're already seeing the prices on those metals already at within 10% of their all-time highs. They're all at their peaks and are going to keep climbing.
And we're just getting started. We haven't even left the starting block.
And we haven't left the starting block. So let's get over ourselves there. I'm a big fan. If you want to expand mining and have a clean energy impact, I think the metals that make the most sense to go double the rate of your mining on are these what are called PGMs, platinum group metals. Today in the catalytic converter that you talk about harvesting, there's 3 of 6 of the platinum group metals are involved in that. There's platinum, palladium, and rhodium are the 3 metals. All, by the way, very pricey right now, right?
Yeah.
There's great value in those catalytic converters. That's why thieves are stealing them like crazy, right?
100%.
Right.
Yep.
In the hydrogen economy, where you generate green hydrogen using renewables, and you can create a fuel basically with a very near zero CO2 footprint. So you can create a fuel with no emissions, and then you can burn the fuel with no emissions. That's a great proposition to help you balance the grid and use as a new energy source. There you're going to need platinum and 2 other PGMs called ruthenium and iridium. Unfortunately, iridium, was at a near all-time high. It touched $7,000 a troy ounce. It's now down to about $4,500 a troy ounce, but it's very expensive. It'll go the way of rhodium. It'll spike to $30,000 in time. I think there's just not going to be enough iridium on the planet to meet the needs there. But this is one where we know where the global reserves are. We have over 200 years of known identified resources of PGMs. They're in South Africa. So we know where to go. That's the good news. The bad news is they're a half mile to a mile deep in the ground.
Yeah.
Some of the most complex mining on the planet. And even with funding, it takes you 15 years from funding to operations to get a new mine off the ground, type of thing, right? So long timelines. But here, I think it's worth spending a little less than $1 trillion and go double the rate of our PGM mining, get more platinum in particular. There, I think we could start penetrating the vehicle market more completely, not with battery-operated electric vehicles, but with hydrogen-fueled vehicles, where you fill up your gas tank. There's literally a compressed tank of hydrogen. Your refueling process is very similar to filling up with gas or diesel. You put in 6-7 kilograms of hydrogen into your vehicle, and you'll go off and have 450 miles of driving range, just like you do in a gas car, and fill up with basically the same frequency and the same duration as a gasoline car.
Well, if you couple that with
there, I think we get the penetration rates could be much deeper than the limits we're going to hit with all these battery metals that are going to constrain us.
And if you couple the hydrogen powered car with the ICE vehicle, basically the gasoline diesel powered car, but you have a better quality catalytic converter off the backside. I mean, I think that's the other kind of missing component. People aren't, I mean, some of these emission standards that are getting put into place, I think those are going to do a lot for the carbon emissions. I think they have the potential to do more than going electric, if you start running through the whole cycle, what it takes to make an electric vehicle and maintain it. But that catalytic converter on the backside, obviously the reason that they are so valuable, the platinum, palladium, rhodium, but they're doing their job. If
absolutely.
Loaded correctly.
Absolutely. And so back to your initial question, what would you do differently if you were king for a day? One is I would curtail and not do as big and ambitious a renewable penetration. I'd push nuclear much harder. 2, I'd push this hydrogen economy harder, and I would double the rate of PGM mining. I'd put some of the Green New Deal investment money into the PGM mining in particular and develop that now. You're going to need it, but it's going to take you 15 years to get there to the mining. So do that investment now. Then I would focus a lot of these hydrogen vehicles on your favorite topic, trucks, heavy duty. The heavy duty long haul trucking lends itself very much to these sorts of vehicles with hydrogen based. They're going to try to force batteries down the throats of a Kenworth truck or a Cummins truck. Come on, who are you kidding? It's going to be a 15,000 pound battery. It's going to dig into your 80,000 pound payload, right?
Yep.
And it's going to need to be recharged for hours on, every day. How is that going to work on long haul trucking? It's just not going to work.
If you think supply chain issues exist today, add that component in there and see where you get.
And so I would take our limited availability of platinum and PGMs early and focus it on heavy duty, not on light duty, not on passenger vehicles. Get your light duty fleets and your medium duty fleets, get those converted to hydrogen first. By the way, that's a different nature of these hydrogen refueling stations. You don't put them in residential neighborhoods. For light duty vehicles, you put them, roadside, freeway side, and you build fewer of these, heavy duty stations. But I think a network of 700 or 1,000 cross-country stations can cover your long-haul trucking for most of the nation. And that would really enable a dramatic transformation. By the way, your heavy-duty trucking emits over 20% of the emissions. So it's a bigger bang for the buck on the CO2 reduction impact.
What's that percentage for just your passenger vehicles? 20% is heavy-duty trucking. What's the
So I think the light duty is in the neighborhood of 60%. Then you get into this range of these medium duty, 6 tons and up that are contributing as well.
Okay.
So I would save all this batteries. I'm absolutely against building big old honking Teslas. I know that sounds crazy. I'm more in favor of putting more cars with small batteries in them, these lithium ion batteries, a la a Toyota Prius. The Toyota Prius has about a 4.4 kilowatt battery in it. It has very limited electrical range, but it bumps your fuel mileage up to 55 miles per gallon pretty easily, just by putting a little battery in there that charges in route. You don't have to have a plug-in charging station. It charges itself on deceleration and braking and yada yada, right? put in force cars into more of these hybrid configurations.
Yeah.
Spread out the available mineral resources in smaller batteries on a larger percentage of the fleet. That has a more profound miles per gallon impact in reducing emissions.
And then maybe have a consistency across the battery line, so you're not getting this mixed bag of items, right? Come
Right.
with some sort of consistency.
Exactly.
Some sort of standard.
Exactly. The yeah, it's just how do you spread out the available resources? You got to have more of a materials mindset here when you look at this, and I think even the recycle systems could be better tailored to that environment as well. It'd be easier to manage. But I think that's a much more viable. Hybrids have been cost effective for over a decade now, right? A Toyota Prius getting 55 miles a gallon pays for itself, right? Then you're only paying.
Oil's not getting cheaper. We all see that coming, right? I mean,
and you're only paying $1,500 to $2,000 more a car for that capability, and you're saving that in gas very easily over the life of the car. Everybody sees that. But to try to force big batteries that are 10 or 18 times the size of that Toyota Prius battery to give you a full range 400-mile plus, long range electric vehicle, those are big batteries. Suddenly you're talking 1,200 pound, 1,300 pounds per car in battery metals.
Yeah,
that's a lot. That's a lot of weight. So,
well, think about the amount of
force
copper
hybrids.
it's going to take to put those big charging stations at these truck stops, right? I mean, you talk about copper and the amount of power you're gonna have to run to create that grid.
Oh yeah.
Take the electric vehicle out of it. Just the grid to get just to get it there is crazy.
Well, that's another little shady part of the EV transition people don't talk about. So today's global power grid, it's 27,000 terawatt hours of electricity generation globally. 27,000. You need to grow that by a little under 13,000 terawatt hours just to charge what will be 2 billion EVs on the road by 2050. So we need to grow today's grid by 50% just to do the charging with all the EVs we're going to create. That's how much more power grid you're going to need, right?
Yeah, and that's why I call.
By the way, what's the CO2 impact of doing that?
Yeah, that's where I call BS on 40%, 30, 40%, by 2030 or whatever that number is. I mean, to be honest, you see where I'm betting my money, right? I mean, hitting rhodium, copper. I'm like, all right, I guess. I mean, silver.
So you talked about, you did well on silver listening to me on my outlook over the past year. One of the metals I've made a good amount of money on is palladium. Palladium and rhodium are two key components in those catalytic converters.
Correct.
And with all these emission standards that have gotten obscenely tight, and there was a big transition that came out of the VW Dieselgate. I don't know if you remember that story, but VW got caught. A lot of their passenger vehicles, which just happen to be diesel passenger vehicles in Europe, they discovered were not operating as advertised. That in operation, they were a lot higher emission than what they were touted to be. And one of the results of that, in addition to some people getting fired and thrown in jail, was they changed the nature of emissions testing. Now, you and I, we get our vehicles tested every year. We go into a place, get our smog test. They stick a probe up your tailpipe. You run it, you rev the engine for a couple, 3 minutes. They take the data and away you go, right? Now they force new car builders to do a 3 to 5 hour test, over hill, over dale, full loads, different driving conditions, and collect data dynamically over that whole time frame. And they could see the true emissions much clearer this way. It's called real world testing. The end user doesn't have to do this, but the OEMs, when they qualify models, have to do these things for each configuration, each model they sell. And these real world test conditions on their own have increased the loadings of these PGMs in catalytic converters some 15% as a result of these real world test conditions. And so to your point, we know how to control emissions in ICE vehicles. And a lot of these regulations have tightened up substantially. The loadings have gone up. That's part of the reason why these prices on rhodium and palladium have gone sky high. And so I was able to invest in palladium on the front end of this. I bought in at 600 and I sold a lot of it at about $2,400 a troy ounce. So I did well on palladium. Rhodium was another one that you could see the shortage coming. Rhodium's a strange little metal. It's difficult to invest in without taking physical possession of it. But I saw it at $1,000 and I knew it was coming, and it went as high as $30,000 a troy ounce. It's now back down to, well, last I looked, it was somewhere around 15. I haven't looked at it today.
I think it's like 13.5 or 13.5, 14. I mean, it came off this last week, but I'm bullish on rhodium and palladium even to this day.
Exactly. I think there's more legs to be had here on those two metals. And so for your auto scrap collectors, just real quickly, what's going on? Why did those metals spike and then back off a bit from their peak about over the past year? It has everything to do with the South African supply disruption. One of the biggest miners, Anglo-American, had trouble with after smelting as a concentrating step where they get the purities to about 90% range. They had trouble and a failure in their concentration plant. And they didn't stop mining. They kept building up bog piles of material to be refined, but they got behind on processing that ore while they rebuilt their concentrator plants. That rebuild is now complete. And so there's been a surge of deliveries on mined material that was accumulating over the past year. And so that surge has brought us down from this peak. So the disruption helped accelerate this peak and the drive up. And now that they're playing catch up, it's come back down. That catch up will complete in late Q1 or Q2 of 2022. Then I think you're back on the upward swing for palladium and rhodium, to your point. I think they will continue their climb starting summer of 2022 and continue to climb for some 3-4 years after that easily.
And combine that with auto deliveries, right? New autos. You combine what you just stated with reduced demand. Maybe not reduced demand, reduced supply, because I feel like the demand is there, but obviously the ability to get them through because of the chip shortage and whatnot.
Right.
That's where me listening to what you have to say and looking at the availability of vehicles and that. At some point, those two are going to cross paths again.
Yep.
You get, a big supply, a big demand push, and then I think we're off the races again. In my opinion.
I think you're exactly right. I think there's the amount of investment surge into semiconductor tooling and factories is just unprecedented. The people that make the equipment for semiconductor, they keep setting record sales quarter over quarter. I mean, they just can't build the equipment quick enough to pack out the nameplate capacities of semiconductor plants quick enough. So people like AMAT and Lam Research are just going crazy. And you're right. So, and they call it a chip shortage. I think that's a misnomer, just to reset your audience.
Okay.
I just think there's a big ass demand on chips.
Oh.
Automotive is growing at a year-over-year growth rate of about 14.5% on chips. A lot of that is the EVs. People don't realize the EVs have twice the electronics as a conventional vehicle, and so you have twice the chips.
Twice the copper, 3 times the copper.
3 times the copper, 2 times the electronics, 2 times the silver, and it's just amazing how many chips that you need in a vehicle these days. They're not gasoline vehicles; they're computers on wheels.
That's I've never heard it stated like that, but that's that's about the truth.
You say you're not in the e-waste business like you were before. If you're doing auto recovery, you're in e-waste.
Yeah.
I contend e-waste and automotive scrap, I'm sorry, they're going to become more difficult to segregate in the future, right? They're going to be phenomenal.
Yeah, the shredder technology of these big facilities, I mean, you're watching them have to upgrade these downstream technologies, and they keep having to add more lines and keep adding more, safety features because lithium-ion batteries are getting through. And I mean, it's just the amount of investment in the back end, the downstream of these shredders is mind-boggling to a guy like me, who even 15 years ago, that wasn't even, it wasn't even close.
Yeah, exactly. So the chips. So anyway, you're with COVID and everybody working from home, all the computer sales, iPads, everything exploded. It was not really anticipated by all the analysts like me. People didn't see it coming. And so there's a surge in demand for all your networking gear and computer stuff at home to work from home. The EVs had a bigger slope on demand for chips than people realized. And just overall, it's not that the semiconductor industry lost ground on its shipments. No, they actually surged in a big way. They just didn't surge enough. So yeah, they're short to total demand, but the rate of their growth is just enormous. I mean, they're going to go from an industry that was doing 440 billion one year to doing over 500 billion the next, to doing over 600 billion the next. That's pretty fast growth on an industry.
Yeah. So maybe the shortage isn't there, just the demand is up.
And this goes to another point that I love to make, is I think we're on the inflection point of the growth in electronics in everyday products. I mean, you can't buy a refrigerator, a washer, a dryer that isn't connected to the internet anymore, right? And with displays and everything on it. And so there's more chips going into everything about our lives. Anyway, the chip world is catching up, and they will catch up. There's even some signs in automotive where we're seeing some lead relief. Ford was running at full capacity for the first time, in over a year. So there are some signs that we're going to get the chips caught up. During this chip quote shortage, the gasoline, the ICE engine variety paid the bulk of the penalty. They did pay preference to the EVs using 2x the loadings of chips in a lot of these, and so the EVs won the priority game. Gasoline vehicles suffered, and so to your point, as the chip industry catches up, and I think in 2022 you'll see a lot more cars on the lot. In the US, if you go by a new dealer lot, you're just stunned how little inventory is on the lot now.
Yeah, it's just used. I mean, the only thing you see some of these new dealerships have on their lot is just some used vehicles. I mean, that's what they have available that takes more than just, that's not pre-sold.
Yep, exactly. And so I think you'll see some of the new car populations, it's going to take them a full year once even the chips are there to fully catch up. But there is pent-up demand. And you're going to see, I think you're right. I think you're going to see an additional surge in palladium and rhodium at the back end of next year, and it will continue into 2023 and beyond for a few more years beyond. And then the question becomes, how much can you really penetrate with EVs? This 4 or 5% penetration as they try to double that to 8 to 10, and then again to 15%. Each one of those multiples, you've got to replicate your mining. And that's just not happening. It's just not happening at the rate.
It goes back to basic math, Yep. Do all the trigonometry, geometry you want to, but I think in life, if you can understand just basic math, you can do pretty good.
And so, Brett, you're going to see copper, you're going to see aluminum continue to climb, you're going to see all these fundamental base metals take off. Again, I'm very pro silver, as you know, and then the PGMs. For the hydrogen economy, I think you're going to see a shift where platinum, this small metal called ruthenium, and another small metal called iridium are going to take front stage and be a problem, in that we don't have enough of those. So that's in very high level my outlook for the world and how this thing's shaping up. So,
well, I will say, Matt, man, I mean, I've been following you, and that's why I wanted to get you on here. Is I'm a big believer in, man, when you hear somebody that knows their shit, whether they know it about, precious metals, they know it about scrap, they know it about trucking, whatever it is, man. I'm big on trying to introduce people that listen to this podcast, like to the smart people that I know exist out there in their specific field. So help me, just real quick before we go, if somebody wanted to come find you, or somebody wanted to see the stuff you're putting out there, I mean, I know, but do you want to let everybody know how to find you?
The easiest, my website is preciousmetalscommoditymanagement.com, preciousmetalscommoditymanagement.com. And all my contact information is there. You can sign up for a weekly newsletter that I do for free, where I touch on a number of these metals and these transitions that we're talking about. Brett, I'm going to work with you offline. We're going to, I'm trying to come up with a subscription report for scrap people in the scrap business like yourself, to help give you some guidance on the hedging and trading that you're doing on these different metals, and what to anticipate over the next 1 to 3 quarters, depending on which metal you're talking about. So I'm trying to have that formulated and ready to go in January for distribution to a number of scrap clients and collectors that want to guide their hedging process. I have a few clients that I work with. I've helped them immensely, play the rhodium market wisely.
Yeah.
There was an interval there where, they were panicked about hedging. I told them, don't hedge. It's only going to double. And sure enough, it did. And the best advice they ever took was listening to me. And
it's worth it. They're like, okay, I'll sign me up for some newsletters.
yeah. So I got one client says, you get 10 years of subscription for me just from that one play alone. So,
well, and like I've told you, I said, I've got some ideas in my head on what we can do and how we can do it. I'm excited to introduce people that don't know you in our audience. I want them to, come find you. You're also fairly active on LinkedIn, so you can find Matt Watson on LinkedIn as well. Go check him out. Go dig through his website. There's a ton of just diamonds in there that I've found over the last couple of years, and it's
different keynotes and Kitco interviews. I have the video links that you could play, and you can listen to me drone on if that's what you're into.
Yeah. And I guys like metalheads like myself, like it's right up my alley. So I just want to say thanks again, Matt. We're going to talk about how we can do some more things moving forward, but I just appreciate you carving out the time and giving us a breakdown on what you know.
Thanks, Brent. My pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
Take care, everybody.
All right, take care.
Stay safe.
Yeah.